All right, we are live, and on today's episode, excited to interview a Kambo practitioner based in Winnipeg, Manitoba. She's a herbalist, apprentice, and co-host of the Sex and Medicine podcast. She's Lyme and autoimmune trained, and here to help others reset, reconnect, and reclaim their health. Welcome to the Winner Circle, Kasey Bennell.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here and discuss Kambo and what other topics we have to discuss today.
Amazing. And the goal of these conversations, as we discussed, is really to uplift, inspire, and empower everyone tuning in just to move forward with greater faith, belief, and trust in themselves on the hero's journey. And the first question I ask everyone just really sets this off on a positive, good vibe note. And that is, Kasey, what do you love about your world right now? Your personal world, not the external world. There's a lot going on out there, but what do you love about your personal world?
Oh man, I am feeling really expansive in 2024. I've got a lot of really cool projects going on. Kambo in the Manitoba world is growing, which is so beautiful to see. I'm the only person offering Kambo in Manitoba, so it's nice to see that medicine kind of being spread throughout the province. Also with like my podcast that I co-host with a really good friend of mine. Is We've just moved into like a new studio, so I've got all these little projects going on. It's a very like exciting and expansive time for me, and I'm just like really excited to see where this year goes and where this year takes like those projects.
Incredible. And yeah, Kambo is definitely something that has piqued my interest in wanting to chat with you about. Hence why we're talking now. So let's just get right into that. What is Kambo? For those that are not familiar, I have a very like brief knowledge, but let's just speak to someone that pretend someone knows nothing about Kambo. What is Kambo? And yeah, start there.
Yeah, so Kambo could be considered like a natural medicine. So it's derived from the secretion of this frog that's found in the Amazon jungle, and this frog is called the Phylomedusa bicolor, or it's also called like a giant monkey leaf frog. So this secretion, if people are familiar with are you familiar with what a peptide is?
No.
Okay, so a peptide then is they're like short chains of amino acids. So amino acids are essentially like the building blocks of our body. They're in plants, they're in animals, they're in us, they're in everything. So what peptides do is they essentially kind of tell your cells how to act. So over time, with things like age and disease and environmental toxins and stress and all these things, our bodily systems get out of balance. So what we're doing when we sit with Kambo is we're essentially like rebalancing all of the systems in the body: your digestive system, the cardiovascular system, your hormonal system, and it just brings the body back to a state of homeostasis. So that's kind of what Kambo does on a physical level. It's really good for a lot of different health applications. So like skin conditions and digestive issues, like you mentioned in the intro, Lyme and autoimmune. It's really, really good for those things. And then on the more emotional kind of spiritual side of things, when we're working with these medicines that are like natural medicines, we're also working with the spirit of the frog in this case. So it's also really good for releasing, repressed emotions and removing energetic blocks and doing things like that. And yeah, that's kind of the basis of what Kambo is and what it does.
So there's so much questions I have from that. But let's first get into how did you get into Kambo? How did you get into becoming a practitioner?
Yeah, so I came across Kambo on Instagram, actually. I came across this woman's profile, and in the profile, it was like Kambo practitioner. And I was like, oh, like, I was just curious what that was. I'd never heard of it before. So I started looking into it. And initially, my thought when I heard about like this frog medicine thing, I was like, oh, that's like, it's so weird, right? It's so out there. I'd never heard anything like that before. But there was something about it that just like really called to me. And anyone who's worked with like plant medicines or amphibian medicines before will kind of have that experience, right? It comes into your life and then it kind of just keeps like showing up again and again. And it's something that you can't stop thinking about. So that's what it was like for me. I just kind of kept thinking about it, and I was just like, oh, like I really need to do this like weird frog thing that I came across online. So fast forward a couple months, and I actually, like, I lost my job and I ended up ending a long-term relationship. So my entire life just kind of exploded in a matter of like 2 months. So at this point, I was really at a place where I felt lost. I didn't know what direction to take my life in. I didn't know what to do. So I found a Kambo practitioner and I was like, all right, well, I'm going to go do this frog thing. So I drove out to Saskatoon. There was a practitioner out there, and I sat with Kambo 3 days in a row, and I just experienced such like profound physical healing and cleansing from it. I think up to that point in my life, I didn't even know what it felt like to feel good. Just with, I had a lot of digestive issues and a lot of like just things and emotions and stuff that I was holding inside of my body. So after those 3 days, I was just like, wow, like this is a really, really incredible medicine. And yeah, that was kind of like how I found Kambo and my first experience with it. And I did my training a few months later and never looked back.
Okay, so again, I have so many questions, but let's just start. How that do you take Kambo? Like, I'm familiar, but like, explain to someone that doesn't. Like, how did you introduce this medicine into your system?
Yeah, so the application process. So what I do is I make small little superficial burns on someone's skin. So typically it'll be like on the ankle, maybe on the forearm or the upper arm or on the back. And I just do that using like a little incense stick. So they're very small. You just take off the top two layers of the skin. And then the Kambo, which kind of comes off in like little, looks like a little glob almost. You put this little round dot, is what they're called, onto this open burn, and then it enters into the body through the lymphatic system and then into the bloodstream, and then it just circulates throughout your entire system.
And so once you do that, like, what is the effect? Like, is it a psychedelic? Is like how like yeah, how does what's the experience like?
Yeah, so Kambo is considered an ordeal medicine, so it's not a psychedelic. There's no hallucinations. There's no psychoactive effects, but it is, being an ordeal medicine. It is difficult. It's a very uncomfortable process. So typically, what it feels like within a couple minutes of your dots being on, you'll start to feel really warm. You get kind of flushed. You might get some tingling, maybe in like your hands, your lips, some throbbing in the head. Your heart rate comes up, so you have all these kind of like uncomfortable sensations going on. And then one of the things that Kambo is famous for is, of course, like the purge that comes with it. So when I say purge, I mean like vomiting. And this typically will happen kind of about halfway through the session. People will start to get a little bit nauseous. You start to sweat, and then you'll start to vomit. And that purge might either come up or it also can go down as well, meaning like you might have to go to the bathroom. And the thing with the Kambo is it only lasts 20 minutes though. So even though it is like, it's very uncomfortable, you don't really feel good, you might be purging. When that 20 minutes is up, the session is over. So it's a short but intense ordeal to go through.
Okay. So, how do you like does everyone purge? Like I've done ayahuasca a bunch of times, and like that purging is very common with ayahuasca, but I seldom purge in ayahuasca. Does everyone purge? And then also, how do you prepare for ceremony or for taking this medicine? Because I know that also affects like your purge. Like if you don't take in like ayahuasca, if you don't adhere to the dieta, like and preparing your body with the foods and just like the different stimulants that you energies you take in and put out affects that process. So yeah, does everyone purge, and how do you prepare for a Kambo ceremony?
Yeah, so not everyone purges. Like I kind of mentioned, some people might like vomit, some people will go to the bathroom, and some people just like don't purge at all. It really depends on like dosage, for example. Maybe if your dosage is a little bit lighter, that the sensations won't be strong enough to actually make someone purge. Or some people just aren't purgers. It's kind of a misconception in the Kambo world that in order to get the benefits of Kambo, you have to purge, which isn't actually necessarily true. Like you're still getting the benefits whether you purge or not. I have yet to be able to kind of connect the dots on like who purges and who doesn't, or why that is. It's kind of like an unknown. It's just like some people do, some people don't. It's whatever the medicine wants to give them, whatever their body needs at that time. And to prepare for a Kambo session, actually all you really need to do is fast for about 8 hours prior to your session. And we just do that so that if you do purge, you're not like throwing up digestive juices and food and stuff like that. So typically it's just an 8-hour fasting window. There is certain things that you can't do, like certain medications that need to be avoided for a certain amount of time. Certain psychedelics like Bufo, for example, you can't do within 6 weeks. So there is some things, but I would say like the main preparation is just that 8-hour fasting window. And that's kind of it.
Sure. And then I know you also use Hapé and Sananga as a part of your ceremony as well. So I guess that is a part. Like, can you explain those two medicines and how they play their part in this whole ordeal?
Yeah, so I offer Hapé and Sananga both prior to doing Kambo. So what Hapé is it's basically like a sacred healing tobacco, or it's also called a shamanic snuff. And the base of this snuff is wild tobacco, and then it's mixed with other plants, leaves, seeds, things like that. It is made by like shamans in the jungle, and it is another sacred medicine. So it actually gets blown up both of your nostrils through a pipe that's called a tepi. And what it's really good for, and why I like to use it prior to Kambo, is it really opens the energetic channels, and it really helps people kind of calm the mind and calm their nerves or any anxiety that they're having prior to Kambo, because most people are a little bit nervous when they come to Kambo. So that's one of the reasons why I like to offer it before. And Sananga is an eye drop. So Sananga is an extract from a shrub, again, found in the Amazon jungle. It stings quite intensely. If you've ever done Sananga, you know what it feels like. Yeah. Yeah. It stings quite intensely. And again, it is really good for just like grounding into the body. And I'd always tell people just like breathe through it, like focus on your breathing. And it really helps people like put them back in their body. On a physical level, Sananga is actually really good for eyesight. So things like nearsightedness, farsightedness, glaucoma, cataracts, things like that, even light sensitivity. So it's got the physical and kind of like the mental, emotional, spiritual going on as well. And that's why I like to offer them both prior to Kambo. Very calming, very grounding.
Yeah, and the Sananga, like, it does not feel nice, but just like, I don't know, for a little bit of time, like maybe like, I don't know, 10 seconds or so, like it's not a prolonged discomfort, but at first it really burns.
Yeah, the initial intensity of it is shocking, but it does dissipate within a minute, I would say.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so you burn these 2 layers of a person's skin. You make 3 dots, I believe you said 3 dots, and then you put the medicine in, and then the effect is felt pretty immediately. There's like a flushing, there's a redness, and then it's gone within 20 minutes. And one thing that you noticed from your 3 days is like you felt really good. So how does like the feeling good play in from like purging and the discomfort? Yeah, like when does the feeling good kick in, and what else? What are some other good benefits? How did they?
Yes.
You're like,
Yeah, so after I did mine, and this is something that I hear commonly from my clients as well, you can kind of think of Kambo as like almost like a cleanse or a detox. So I remember just feeling so clean. Like I felt lighter. I felt like my body was just like functioning at full capacity. And I will explain it to people like it's almost like hitting the factory reset on your body. Suddenly you have more energy, you're sleeping better, you feel so much more grounded, like increased sense of gratitude, increased sense of like self-awareness, like all of these things start to come up in the days and weeks following Kambo. And it depends, like everybody is so different. So it depends if you're, for example, if you're dealing with like an autoimmune condition, you may have a reduction in whatever symptoms you're dealing with. Or if you're just looking for like increased energy and stamina, some people come to it specifically for that. And then in the days and week following, they're just like so much energy. They're just so focused, like getting so many things done. So it really is such an individual process. It depends on like what each person is looking for.
Okay. So what are what are the possible like adverse effects, or are there any?
Yeah, so there's like a couple risks with Kambo in a general sense. Like Kambo is very safe, even though it seems a little weird with like the frog thing and you're burning and the vomiting. It's a little bit scary, but there are some risks associated, and typically the biggest one is fainting. So at like certain times, like some people will faint, and it's typically at the point where they kind of like will stand up during their session, they go to walk to the bathroom, and they might, maybe they're too weak and they will faint at that time. So we are trained to deal with that and to recognize the signs of that, and to kind of prevent that from happening. But that's probably your most common risk. There's also another one that I always like to highlight, and it's actually it's called hyponatremia, which is a risk of water toxicity. So when we're fasting for a certain amount of time and then we drink a whole bunch of water, it will actually start to flush your blood sodium levels out, which kind of puts you at risk for, like I mentioned, this condition called hyponatremia, which is essentially water toxicity. Like you've drank too much water and it's flushing your system too much. So that's another risk. And what I do to avoid that is essentially you just have to work with like less water, and keep track of the amount of water that people are drinking throughout their sessions. So you're kind of in a risk zone if you're in a fasted state and you've drank, say, over 2 liters of water. That is a little bit of the risk zone there. I will only have people drink 1 liter of water. So like the risk is there, but we mitigate the risk to the point where it's not even something that I have to worry about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so what happens if you drink too much water? Could you repeat that?
Yeah, so you'll get this condition called hyponatremia, which it can result in like seizures, coma, and even death if it gets too bad. It's something that commonly happens to athletes actually when they're sweating and they're drinking water and they're not eating. So
Okay.
it's yeah, it can result. It can be a really serious condition. We just mitigate it to the point where it's not actually that much of a concern for us.
Okay, so the Kambo and that water overload, they interact, and so is this related to the Kambo you're saying? Like the
It's actually not related to Kambo. It's related to like the process of the session as a whole, because we have to have someone drink water prior to doing Kambo, for when they purge. The water just makes the purge easier. So if you're in a fasted state and you don't have water in your system, you're just going to be like heaving and it's really uncomfortable.
yeah.
So the risk of hyponatremia is actually not even related to Kambo. It's not a danger of Kambo. It's a risk of like the entire process, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. No, it's just that's something I've never heard of, so it's very interesting. Another thing that I never have heard of much of is something you talked about is peptides.
Mm.
Um, I've heard of it like in the mixed martial arts world, which I am a part of, and in athletics as well. They're using peptides for recovery. So BPC 157, I don't know if you've heard of that, or BT 500. Um, have you heard of those?
I haven't, no, not those ones specifically, but I do know that like peptide therapy and things like collagen and like even insulin is a peptide as well. So I do know that they're being used for like recovery, and it's kind of gaining more popularity as well.
Yeah, so it's like to help like ligaments recover and like strengthen ligaments. I think that's how some fighters are using it, athletes to help recover from injury. So yeah, like what exactly is a peptide, and how does that work? Because you talked about peptides and Kambo um, being related.
Yeah, so like I mentioned previously, like Kambo actually contains, it's it's like 27 different peptides. So for example, like some of them, like there's a dermaceptin, dermorphin, there's deltorphin. I won't list them all, but just a couple examples there. And what these peptides do is when they enter your body, they work at like a cellular level. So they essentially act like little messengers and tell your cells how to act. So if your body's out of balance and you're resulting in skin conditions or digestive issues or anything like that, it's that's just an imbalance in the body. So when Kambo brings everything back into balance, you're essentially working at a root cause to heal those issues. I don't know if there's any peptides in Kambo that are specifically good for like recovery, for example, like muscles and ligaments. But I do know, I believe there have been like practitioners that have worked with like high level athletes, or even my teacher worked with a couple former NFL players who were really damaged from their careers, of course, and a lot of concussions and back issues, neck issues, and things like that. And they saw really good results in working with Kambo.
So the first time you used Kambo, you did it for 3 days. What is the general protocol on like how often you should do Kambo? Is this like a one-time thing? Like you do it for 3 days, or I guess it depends on a person. But yeah, like what is like how often should people be taking this medicine?
Yeah, so again, it's a really individual thing and it depends on the person's process. So myself, like I'm relatively healthy. I like to use it as a kind of like a proactive or a preventative health thing. And I'll say it maybe once every 8 weeks or so. And I always tell my clients, like, listen to your body. And when you feel like maybe you need a tune up or you just need like a really good cleanse or something, then go to the medicine. It depends as well. Like if you have, for example, like Lyme or autoimmune, typically people like that will do kind of like a lower dose than the average person, maybe a little bit more often. So they might do it once every 4 weeks or something like that. I like to do kind of start off doing like maybe 3 in 3 days or 3 in 3 weeks to really get in there and really cleanse everything out, and then kind of go into more of like a proactive or a preventative health approach, like I mentioned, then go into like once every 8 weeks or so.
Okay. And is this something like someone could apply themselves, or is it something that you do under the supervision of like a practitioner like yourself?
I really wouldn't recommend doing it on your own, especially if you're not trained. There's a lot of things that can go wrong if you don't know what to look for. Even as a trained practitioner, when I self-administer to myself, I will always have someone sitting with me, just in case, like maybe I do faint and you need someone there to like help you through that, or take off the Kambo dots. There is a course that you can take to learn how to self-admin. So some people will do that if they just are interested in serving themselves, but they don't really want to do it for other people. But I wouldn't recommend just anyone finding a Kambo stick online and then buying it and kind of starting to apply it to themselves without any training or information on it.
So what's like the legality of the Kambo medicine?
So it is unregulated currently in Canada, not legal, not illegal, but it's just kind of like in that gray area. And yeah, it's just kind of like floating in that. It's relatively unknown in Canada, and I think that's why it's kind of just like under the radar currently.
Okay. So you've mentioned using other plant medicines. Bufo is one, and we've talked about others as well. But let's start with Bufo. What is that, and how else have plant medicines helped you on your journey?
Yeah, so Bufo was actually my first big like psychedelic journey, and Bufo is the secretion from a toad. Actually, it's called the Bufo alvarius toad, and it contains DMT. And if anyone is not familiar with DMT, it's a psychoactive or highly psychedelic component that is also in ayahuasca as well. It's the psychoactive component in ayahuasca. So when I did DMT, just it was just the most beautiful experience. And it really connected me, I feel like, to seeing myself as kind of like one with everything. Like once you see yourself outside the physical, which is what happened when I did Bufo, like I left the physical body and was just kind of like floating around as a spirit and like one with everything. So it really changed the way I viewed even like the trees or the plants or anything like that. And once you see yourself outside the physical, you understand that everything else is the same, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. So what led you to Bufo, to your first experience with plant medicine? Where did that take place?
Yeah, I did that when I finished my Kambo practitioner training. They also offered Bufo. I was down in Colorado, and it was like a happy graduation. You guys made it through the practitioner training program, and then they offered the optional Bufo ceremony at the end. So that's kind of like Kambo was my first introduction into the plant and amphibian medicine world, which then led me to Bufo and that experience. And then Kambo also led me to ayahuasca as well about 6 months later.
Mm-hmm. So we'll get into ayahuasca in a second, but for Bufo, how do you consume that? Do you smoke it?
Yeah, so Bufo, the secretion from the toad, I believe, is crystallized, and then you
Yeah,
smoke it out of a pipe, essentially.
yeah. And then I would say it's probably like 20 minutes or so as well. It's like short acting.
Yeah, very short. Mine, I was like 10 to 15 minutes, and I believe some people might be in the experience for like up to 40 minutes, I've heard, but it is fairly short.
Yeah, and definitely something I would recommend doing with like someone that's trained in facilitating that medicine because it's very powerful.
Yeah, incredible. I definitely would not do it on my own, that's for sure.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, and then so then that led you to ayahuasca. So what was that experience like, and where did that take place?
Yeah, so I actually did ayahuasca here in Manitoba at a retreat center. Um,
Okay.
the experience, like ayahuasca for me, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. But it was also led me into my most like profound healing. It was really like a huge catalyst for me. And essentially, what happened is I went through, and I don't like to really use the term ego death because I feel like it's a little bit misleading. You can't really kill the ego, and it's, part of the human experience. But I will say that it really dismantled my entire sense of self and my entire identity and who I thought I was. So when I went through this ayahuasca ceremony, I was, purging and having things and emotions and all of these really deep seated things that I'd been holding on to for so long suddenly released and removed from my body, which I think was the kind of the catalyst for, all of these things are holding this identity that I have, they're holding it together. And then you have those things removed and my entire, sense of self just kind of fell apart. So after that ceremony, I actually kind of fell into a depression for about a week. I had a really hard time. Like I couldn't even get out of bed. And I was just like, I don't know who I am. I don't know what to do. I don't like, who am I? And I just had a really hard time afterwards. Luckily, I kind of came to this conclusion, you want to call it like intuition or divine intervention or whatever. But I had this like thought pop into my mind. And when I'm sitting there saying, like, I don't know who I am, and it's like, okay, great, because this is the perfect opportunity to rebuild yourself into the person that you actually want to be. And that's why I say ayahuasca was such a catalyst for me because it really catapulted me into a new version of myself.
So who did you think you were before? And now, from what you learned, who are you today?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. I think before I really kind of got caught up in the ego world of this is when I had just started serving Kambo. So if for anyone who's not familiar, sometimes like people who serve medicines you get really caught up in the ego of it, right? And it becomes more about me than actually like serving and like helping other people. So I think like I got caught up in that, and ayahuasca really ripped me down a notch in a really loving and humbling way. And was like, no, like you are like you placed yourself on a pedestal and you need to come back down. And, it's really hard for when you have this like view of yourself, you're like, oh, like I'm doing all of this stuff and it's so amazing. And I kind of like, you put yourself on a pedestal. So it was very humbling, I would say. It was incredibly humbling and really just brought me back down to earth and grounded me, I think. And from there is when my life started to change a lot more. I feel like I started to come more into alignment with my purpose, I guess I would say. So I ended up like moving and I went down to Peru and I did some traveling and I quit a job that I was in that was really like unfulfilling. It was like I was working in a starch plant, working like night shifts, and it was just this really, I felt like I was in a cage essentially. So I think that experience just kind of gave me the strength, the perspective, and the ability to get more into alignment with actually who I wanted to be, as opposed to, continuing to work at a job I didn't want to work at and live in a place that I didn't want to be at.
Yeah, let's examine that a bit more. So you felt like a calling in your heart to like kind of leave the 9 to 5, the safe, like secure job, something that you didn't like, to pursue like being an entrepreneur, like going further with this plant medicine, launching your own podcast.
Mm-hmm.
How did that look like? How did you transition from that safe world to the unknown world, and how did fear come into this? How did you push past that fear?
Yeah. So I spent most of my 20s working in like operations management, production, manufacturing, things like that. And the reason I got into this work was for the money. I lived in a small town. The money in these places was really good. So you're just, when you're, 18, 19, 20, that's kind of the direction you go. You just want to make money. And what happened is, I found myself 5, 6, 7 years down the road, just like really, really miserable, and just knowing that this wasn't what I wanted to do. But again, like you do get kind of stuck in that with the stability, right? You have a paycheck every 2 weeks, you've got bills to pay. What are my other options? I didn't know. But I think that inner knowing and just like the drive to want something different is really what propelled me forward into just like continuing to search and really taking that leap and saying like, I'm going to start my own business. And yeah, fear was huge in that, because when you're used to stability and the certainty of that paycheck every 2 weeks, and suddenly your income is up and down. So there was a huge, like a lot of money fears came up there, and a lot of fears of uncertainty and instability. One of the other fears is just like kind of going out in your own direction and doing your own thing and having to pave your own way in something that other people, or not a lot of people, are doing. So it's a fear of being seen, fear of being judged, and fear of being criticized. So yeah, there's so many things that I think moving into the entrepreneurial world is very confronting. It really makes you like look at yourself and deal with a lot of the things and a lot of the fears that you're kind of like holding and they're ruminating inside of you. But on the flip side of that, it's also so much more fulfilling than working in a job that you know that you don't want to be at. So yeah, it's just so much more fulfilling and rewarding to be in something that I would say is more purpose driven.
Mm-hmm. So when that fear arises for you in the past and still today, how do you overcome it?
Oh yeah. So my kind of process is I typically will feel these things come up, and I'll use money as an example. Like, oh, like I don't have any money coming in. What am I going to do? Like these thoughts, they start to circulate, and the fear just really takes over. And you're like, okay, now I can't tell you how many times that I have literally like gone on Indeed and been like, I have to go back to the factories. I have to get a job. Like I'm not going to make it. But I always just listen to my intuition. And anytime I look at going back to these jobs, I really tune into my body, and I'm just like, I know this doesn't feel right to me to go back to something that I knew I wasn't fulfilled in and I knew I wasn't happy in. It just doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel good. And it doesn't feel like the direction that I want to take my life. So typically what I do when these fears take over is I really just like have to trust that everything at the end of the day will work out. And that's been a huge lesson as well, just learning to trust yourself that you can do it. Trust in like the process. I know like anyone that starts in their own business will say it is not easy, and you'll spend a lot of time probably in the beginning really struggling. So just like trusting in all of these things and just really pushing through and continuing to push yourself outside of your comfort zone, because that's a really big part of it as well.
Mm-hmm. What's a recent example of you stepping outside your comfort zone and yeah, like realizing, oh, it's okay?
Yeah, I would say like this whole podcast thing. My friend Chelsea and I launched the podcast in November, and I used to have just like a crippling fear of like speaking in front of people, like being on camera, all of those things. So I remember when we started filming, and it was just so nerve wracking being on camera. It was like awkward, it's uncomfortable. But just like the knowing that it will get better over time. And I think everyone feels like that when they do something that they're afraid of, whether it's public speaking or whatever it is. But yeah, that was a really tough one for me recently. But just knowing that like you learn and you will get better with it over time, and not shrinking back from the fear. Like that's a big one for me, is like I could have chosen to not start the podcast because I was like, so afraid of speaking in front of people, being on camera, being heard, being seen, being criticized. But yeah, and just like confronting the fear and kind of moving through it anyways.
Yeah, and I feel like the more we step into kind of our discomfort, the easier it is,
Yeah, totally. You get used to the process.
Yeah, you're immunizing yourself to be uncomfortable. So your podcast with Chelsea Browse is Sex and Medicine podcast, the Sex and Medicine podcast. Tell us about that. What is it about, and what is your goal with the podcast? Why did you and Chelsea want to create this? And first, I guess, how did you and Chelsea even meet?
Yeah, so Chelsea and I actually met on Instagram earlier this year. I followed her through like a mutual friend. She ended up like following me back, and then she ended up reaching out to me and was just like, "Hey, like what you're doing is really cool. Do you want to grab coffee sometime?" And it turns out that we only lived like 5 minutes from each other. We were living in the same neighborhood. So we met, we had coffee, and we really just like became friends and clicked. And then the podcast developed really organically. We actually would meet up for little like morning coffee walks in the park, and we would end up sitting by the river and just chatting for 2-3 hours or whatever it was. And then one day Chelsea was just like, we should record one of these and we'll just do it for content. We were like, oh, okay, sounds good. So we did that, and then we were like, oh hey, like we should start a podcast. So it really grew organically like that. And I think our intent with the podcast was always to talk about a lot of the topics that don't necessarily come up. Maybe they're a little bit more risky. And that's one of the reasons why we named it like Sex and Medicine, because it is a little bit more risky. And with Chelsea's work, she is like a relationship coach and a sexologist, and that's kind of her side of things. And then me being in Kambo with frog medicine, we just are kind of in these like alternative worlds. So the things we like to talk about are just like, our own journeys and spirituality and sexuality. And we've talked about like psychedelics as well. We recently did an episode on porn and birth control. So we just kind of like to dive into the little bit of like the controversial topics and just discuss them in a really open manner. And kind of just make it a really like down to earth approach. And like, it's just, you're talking with your friends, and it's just a really warm and open conversation.
All right. Yeah. So we've talked quite a bit about the medicine. So let's talk about sex. Like what's most alive for you in that sphere that maybe you and Chelsea have talked about, or that you look forward to talking about with Chelsea on your podcast?
Yeah. So like some of the examples of things that we have talked about are very like things that are affecting culture. So like hookup culture, dating. Like I mentioned, we just did an episode on porn and birth control. So, and we weave into these topics a lot of like our own experiences to kind of give it a more grounded approach, I guess, and a more like relatable approach. That was a big thing for us. We really wanted to be relatable. So yeah, like we typically don't plan too much in advance when it comes to like the topics that we want to talk about on sex. It's just like, hey, what's alive in our life right now, and let's grab this topic and let's just kind of like go on it.
Okay. Well, out of those topics, what I'm most interested in just kind of chatting, pulling the thread on more is dating culture. What's your reflections on that?
Yeah, so dating culture in 2023 last year was is really rough. I was out of the dating world for a couple of years, went through a breakup, was kind of going through my own stuff and just wasn't really interested. Moved to Winnipeg, and then I was like, all right, like I'm gonna get back into the dating world. And I found it was just really, I just found I didn't relate to a lot of the people in the way that I used to. And I think that's what happens when you kind of go from one way of living, like I mentioned, kind of like working a regular job, living in a small town, just, you know, kind of living that life, into this world of like entrepreneurship and medicine and things like that. And I found you just couldn't relate to a lot of people. Like I would mention Kambo and what I do for work, and they were just like what, and just completely, you know, you get a blank stare. So that was a big one for me with like the dating world. And also I think right now what we're seeing in our world, there's a lot of polarization between like political views and, you know, views on whatever the pandemic or whatever you want to talk about there. There's a lot of like, you're either on one side of the spectrum or you're on the other side of the spectrum. So it's hard finding someone whose values line up with yours. I think when it comes to business, when it comes to not that everything has to align, like you're totally allowed to have different views on things. But when it comes to like your core values, I found I had a hard time like finding someone who really aligned with that with me.
Yeah. So how did you or how do you do that? Like, 'cause I feel like, yeah, in Winnipeg, especially, it's very closed. It's a very closed off um, city where people are just kind of settled in their ways, and like they have like 9 to 5 jobs. They hang out with the same circles, and when outsiders come talk to them, it's like, oh, like what does this person want? Like it says friendly Manitoba on the license plate here, but I don't believe that to be true. Like people are here friendly if you know them or if they know you through someone, but like I feel there's a lot of stranger danger here in this city compared to some more of the liberal places I've been, like including Austin, Texas, where there's so many people that are like newcomers to that city, and everyone's out looking just to meet like-minded people. Where we're here, people are really set in their ways.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. Like I'm from a small town, and I remember like when you grow up in a small town, like you said, everyone hangs out with the same people. It's the same group. Like I could leave and come back 10 years later, same people doing the same thing, going to the same like small town bar and kind of like living that life. And you're right when what's that?
Basic,
Yes.
basic. Like watch football, watch hockey, like just basic life.
Yeah, and I remember also like, you know, when you have a stranger come in or someone new moves to town or whatever, everyone kind of gives them like that side eye. They're like, "Oh, who are you? What do you
Yeah,
want? Where are you from?" kind of thing.
yeah.
So the way I kind of like combated that when it comes back to like the dating world is I had tried the whole like online dating thing, wasn't having very much success. I actually ended up being invited through a Kambo client of mine to like this potluck, like-minded community here in Winnipeg, and I actually did end up meeting my current boyfriend. So it ended up working out in the end, just through I think probably like chance and just in a group of people that I happened to get invited to of like-minded people.
Like networking, I'd say. So yeah, what would be your dating advice that you've learned from personal experience and then through your discussions with Chelsea, and yeah, outside of just the apps, because I don't feel those are very like I don't there are stories where have worked with people, but I think they're pretty shallow to an extent and very surface level. Also, I feel it puts you in a state of lack. Like I'm a very big fan and follower of like Esther Hicks and Abraham, and like in their teachings, So all about the feeling. And so if you're always like looking on your app, you're always in a state of like lack. Um, and it also prevents you from stepping outside your comfort zone. It's like, oh, I'm doing something about my dating because I'm on this app, but so you're not putting yourself out there. So yeah, no, I'm not a fan of apps. What's your dating advice from your personal experience and your professional experience?
I think the number one thing for me is like would be to get clear on your values and what exactly you want. Because when you know what you want, it makes it a lot easier to find someone who is in alignment with you and the life that you want and who you are. So that would be number one. Like just get clear on your values, the direction that your life is going, and what you want. And then I would say the same. Like I would probably avoid the dating apps, and I would work on maybe joining groups of whether it's a Facebook group, whether it's like from Meetup or something that is of interest to you, where you would likely meet someone who would have the same interests. So that would be my kind of like two main ones.
One way to get clear is through journaling. Journaling is a big self-care practice of mine. It's a fundamental of my self-care routines. What are some of your fundamental self-care routines in the physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual sectors?
Yeah, so I love journaling as well. Journaling's been something that I've been doing for years. I really find it helps clear up the like the clutter in your mind, right? It's in your mind, you get it out on paper, and then it's gone. So journaling is one for me for sure. Meditation is really big for me. I do daily, a little like a short daily meditation, maybe 5 to 10 minutes or so. I just take that space, whether it's in the morning or whether I've got a little bit of time at lunch, to just kind of like sit, tune in with like how I'm feeling, any like emotions that are coming up, anything like that. Another one I really like is dream work. Actually, if you're someone who has like I have really vivid, really like weird dreams, and quite a few years ago, I started to dream journal as well, and then kind of like started like googling and like bought the dream books and trying to like dissect the meanings behind the dreams. And I love that practice. I feel like there's a lot of messages in our dreams and a lot of guidance and stuff that can come through once we start to pay attention to them. So that's kind of like on the mental, emotional side.
Mm-hmm.
Physically, I really like kickboxing. I go to a gym here in Winnipeg. It's like a new thing for me. I've been going since last summer. Love it. Love the workout. And I feel like it just really kind of gets me like amped up for the day, right? Get the blood pumping, you get everything flowing, and then you're really prepared to just kind of like take on the day. So yeah, I think those are probably my main kind of like self-care things that I do.
One of my favorite authors, Stephen Pressfield, he describes resistance as that negative force in that world that keeps us from fulfilling our dreams. And it often comes up when like it's that thing that keeps you in bed, not going to that gym, or it's that thing that keeps you from writing in your journal, or it's that thing that keeps you from like saying yes to going on that podcast or starting your podcast. What have you learned about resistance on your journey, and how do you overcome it?
Yeah, so I like to always picture the person that I want to be. So you have the person that you are right now. And for example, like getting invited onto a podcast, it's like, is this getting me closer to the person that I want to be? There might be resistance there might be fear, there might be these things coming up. But if that thing that I'm afraid of is one step closer to the life that I want to create, that's always like the question that I ask myself. I say like, is this, in alignment with where I want to go? And if it is, then do it anyway. Like you'll still have the fear, probably still going to have the anxiety, you're still going to have that resistance, but there has to be like that conscious decision to like, I know this is going to be hard, but I'm going to do it anyway.
I love that answer. I've asked this question many times, and that's been one of my favorite responses. And that's a very simple thing to ask, like a self inquiry.
Mm-hmm.
Is this something that the person I want to be would be doing? And usually, when you go do that thing, you feel great, almost 100% of the time.
Yeah, then you realize that you're like, oh, that actually wasn't nearly as bad as my mind was telling me it was.
Yeah. So we've talked about a lot of positive stuff. Let's talk about challenges. Let's, in particular, um, your biggest challenge? What would you say has been the biggest challenge you've met and encountered on your path, and how did you overcome and learn from it?
Mm. Yeah, so I think my biggest challenge was probably the fear of being seen, like I kind of mentioned already, or the fear of criticism and judgment, which really, when you go to the root cause of it, is likely fear of rejection and fear of, abandonment and things like that. So how to overcome that is, I think for me, it was just a lot of like really digging into the root causes of those fears and like where they're coming from, and really like working on releasing a lot of that emotion and stuff from my body, which I've done through meditation, through somatic work, through psychedelics, through Kambo, things like that. Um, and then, like we've kind of mentioned already, just kind of putting yourself in the position where you know that there's fear is going to be there, but you just have to do it anyway. And then another one for me was the speaking thing. I kind of mentioned this already before. It was really like horrible fear of public speaking. Even 1 year ago, like I couldn't even send a voice note to somebody without like having a nervous system reaction. Like I would just like freeze with it. And again, it's just like doing it again and again and again until it's not scary anymore. So it's really the only way to overcome a challenge, I think, is just to put yourself in it and just do the thing that you're afraid of.
Very wise. Lots of wisdom shared. A lot of this wisdom that you shared, or that ways you got here, are through different mentors and helpers that you've met on your path. Let's take a moment to acknowledge some of these people, whether like they're people you've met or they're authors or people you heard speak. But yeah, who have been some of the mentors, influences, helpers in your life? Who were they, and what were your key takeaways you've learned from them that you've incorporated into your being? You don't have to name every single person that has helped you on your path, but who are some that come to mind?
Yeah, the first one that comes to mind is immediately this naturopathic doctor I actually started seeing when I was in my early 20s. So, like, long story short, I was diagnosed with a benign bone tumor when I was in my early 20s in my shin bone. And I kind of went through like the CTs, the MRIs, the blood work, the Western medical, thing. Did not get any of the answers that I was looking for, really didn't receive any help in that aspect. So I ended up going the naturopathic route, and through a combination of talk therapy with this doctor, hydrotherapy, and acupuncture, she really showed me and really blew my mind wide open to how our emotions will affect our physical body. And at this point in my life, I had no concept of this. I was, 22, 23 at the time. It wasn't something that was on my radar. And it turns out this tumor was just like a physical manifestation of everything that I had repressed inside. And that's what this doctor really instilled in me. And she completely changed the trajectory of my life. And I would even call her the reason I went through like my first spiritual awakening. So she is like the most prominent one that comes to mind from me. And I still hold on to like a lot of the things that she taught me at the time. Like she was the first one that got me into meditation and reading different books and things like that. Someone else that would come to mind as well are my teachers for Kambo. So I was trained through a company called Tribal Detox. The guy and the couple that run it, his name is Jason and her name is Kelly, and they were really pivotal as well in me getting into Kambo. And I continue to this day, it's been almost 2 years, I continue to learn and reach out from him as well. And I would also say, even going back a little bit more, my original Kambo practitioner as well, like I wouldn't be here if I wouldn't have had those first experiences with that practitioner. And it was such a beautiful experience to be held in like that space by her. So again, another person that like really changed the trajectory of my life. And I don't think that I would be here if it wasn't for, those people mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Um, Thank you for sharing that. And like you've learned a lot from these people about how to be of service to others. And I know this is important to you. So yeah, what have you learned about being of service that you'd love to share with our listeners?
For me, when I get, so I'll explain like this. Not Kambo's not for everyone, and you might get one person out of 10 who is really really impacted by it. And when I get that feedback from that client, and they say like, wow, like I was able to release something that I've been holding on to since I was a little girl, or I looked at myself and I thought I was so disgusting, but suddenly like I feel really beautiful, or like I've been holding on to this anxiety for so long, and in one session I was just able to release it. That's what being in service to me is all about. It's like that 1 in 10, that person that it really really impacts, because that's how I was impacted from Kambo, and that, of course, that's what I want to bring to other people as well.
Amazing. So every episode I ask the guest final few questions, the final 3 questions, and we've got to that place. So let's start. First question. Through all the highs and lows that is this hero's journey, what do you feel has been the greatest life lesson you've learned on your path that you feel called in this moment to share with us?
I would say to get good at learning. One thing that even at my time in the workforce, in the 9 to 5, I have really, and then in entrepreneurship as well, you have to be able to learn new skills. You have to be able to learn different jobs, different platforms, different whatever it is. So if you can get your learning process down, and you can, admit when you We're back.
Back. So yeah, we're just talking about the importance of learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You froze there. I don't know if you're able to, if you finished what you said, but Zoom would have recorded that.
Okay. Do you want me to reiterate? I can go over it again if you want.
Just in case.
Okay, yeah. So I just said like my number one lesson is probably just to get good at learning. No matter what you do, whether it's, you are in the workforce doing the 9 to 5 thing, whether you're becoming an entrepreneur, whatever it is you're doing, we have to be continuously learning, changing, and evolving. So one thing that I found really beneficial and it's helped me is that to understand my own learning process and to understand how I learn. So I'm a very hands-on learner, for example. I can read something 50 times and not retain it. I can do something 5 times and retain it a lot better. So just understanding the ways in which you learn, and then getting good at those processes really will help you move through life, and even in just a general sense.
Very well said. Thank you. Next question. In 3 words, how would you describe the experience you were having on this earth? So it doesn't have to be a sentence, but what 3 words would describe the experience you're having on this earth? And you could elaborate on those words as well if you want.
The first one that comes to mind is roller coaster. The second one, adventure and exciting. Those are my 3.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Final question. We've examined your past, we've examined your present. We'll transport into the future, and we're going to be alongside an 85-year-old Kasey Bennell. Who is that 85-year-old woman? Where are you? Who are you surrounded by? What has been the legacy you've left in your 85 years here? And what are the predominant feelings in your being?
Wow, that's an amazing question. I hope that when I get to 85, it is one of my goals in my life to be able to look back and say that I never let fear stop me from doing the things that I wanted to. So I don't have regrets, because anything that I wanted to do, I did it regardless of how afraid I was. I hope, location wise, anywhere in the world, I'm up for it. I will go anywhere. I hope that, I'm surrounded by a family that I have created and have, loved all through those years, grandkids, husband. And I hope that everyone who came in contact with me felt seen and felt heard by me, and felt like I was, a safe space or a safe woman to be around.
And the predominant feelings in your being?
Love, fulfillment, purpose. Yeah, those are the three feelings that come.
Sure. Like, I just encourage you to close your eyes, take a deep breath, and really connect with those feelings, love, fulfillment, and purpose. Embody those, feel those. And I'm going to bring us back to the present day. And that 85-year-old Kasey, she sends current day Kasey a message. What does she whisper in your ear?
Keep going and keep doing what you're doing.
Beautiful. I say the same. Keep going, keep doing what you're doing. And for anyone who wanted to connect with you, Kasey, they could find you on Instagram at Kasey Bennell. And they could check out yours and Chelsea's podcast on Instagram as well at Sex and Medicine Podcast, which we'll link to where they can find that.
Yes, yeah. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, or my website also is kambomanitoba.com. Very simple.
Amazing. Any last closing words?
No, I just want to thank you for having me and for having this discussion and allowing me to talk about Kambo and life and everything else. So thank you so much.
Beautiful. And my interest has been piqued, and I hope to sit with you for a session
Yes.
time soon.
Yeah, I would love that.
To close every episode, we bring our fist in, a step into the winner circle, always a choice. Boom, digital fist bump. Thank you. And that's a wrap.
Thank you.